Ever feel like certain ideas, or maybe just certain ways of talking about things, don't just appear randomly, but somehow solidify and become, well, just the accepted normal, like they've always been there?
Yeah, or maybe you've wondered why some people or groups get neatly categorized and then treated in specific, sometimes very limiting ways,
Yeah.
as if those categories are just natural.
It's that feeling that the world is ordered in a particular way,
Yeah,
right? And we just accept it.
we do. We often don't see the underlying forces or the history that put those orders in place. It's easy to miss the construction behind what just feels natural.
Exactly. And today we are doing a deep dive into some absolutely fundamental and honestly pretty powerful ideas from the work of the late French philosopher Michel Foucault.
Right.
We're going to focus particularly on how he thought about something he called discourse, and then later how he analyzed discipline.
And these aren't just, abstract academic terms. They're concepts Foucault developed to help us look below the surface
Below the surface of what, exactly?
of how we understand the world, how we understand ourselves, to see the sort of hidden rules and practices that shape us, often without us even realizing it.
Okay. And you, our listener, asked us for a simpler, more accessible way to wrap your head around some of these core Foucauldian concepts.
With practical examples, right, based on the sources you shared with us.
Precisely. And that's exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack some key nuggets from these texts and show you how they offer a different lens for viewing the world around you, a lens that might make you see things, well, differently.
We'll be pulling primarily from key excerpts of Foucault's major works, Archaeology of Knowledge.
Which deals a lot with that discourse idea.
Exactly. And Discipline and Punish, which, as the title suggests, gets into power, control, and the body.
And then we'll really try to explore how some of these dense but incredibly insightful ideas might connect with themes in the other fascinating materials you provided.
Yeah, things like discussions of colonial history, the influence of media and cartoons, gender roles, the construction of social norms. It's quite a mix.
It is. Our goal is to help you grasp the fundamental ways Foucault suggests we look at how knowledge and power intertwine, often invisibly, to shape our world and the people in it.
It's about seeing the systems, really, the systems that make certain things possible to say or do, and other things impossible or unthinkable.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with that first big, maybe slightly tricky idea, discourse, and Foucault's approach to understanding it, which he calls archaeology.
Right. So when Foucault talks about discourse, especially in his earlier work like Archaeology of Knowledge, he's coming at the study of ideas and history from a really different angle compared to how it was traditionally done.
How so? What's the traditional way that he's sort of pushing back against?
Well, traditionally, if you were looking at a bunch of statements or texts from a particular time or field, let's say psychiatric medicine in the 19th century, or maybe economic theories in the 17th century, you'd probably ask questions about the people who wrote them, right?
Yeah, like who was this person? What were they trying to say?
Exactly. You might ask, what did the author or speaker really mean? Or what was their conscious intention behind these words? You try to understand their individual thoughts, their motivations.
Maybe even their unconscious drives, trying to get inside their head.
Precisely. Looking for a hidden intention or a deeper personal meaning behind the words on the page.
Okay.
As Foucault himself puts it in Archaeology of Knowledge, traditional analysis often asks, what was being said in what was said? It's like searching for a secret message or some silent thought running underneath that gives the real meaning to the words you actually see.
Like digging for buried treasure behind the text.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
It is often an allegorical approach, seeking something beyond or behind the discourse itself, something rooted in the mind or the soul of the person who produced it.
Okay, so Foucault comes along and says, hang on, let's try looking at this differently.
Exactly. His analysis, which he calls archaeology, points in a different direction. He's less interested in the individual mind, the author's intention, and much more interested in the statement itself.
The statement itself.
Yeah. He says we need to grasp the statement in the exact specificity of its occurrence, understand its conditions of existence, fix its limits, establish its correlations with other statements.
Whoa, okay. Slow down a bit. Conditions of existence. Limits. What does that mean in plain English?
It means it's less about what was meant by the person saying it, and more about the statement itself as an actual event that happened in time and space.
An event, like a historical happening.
Sort of, yeah. Like, where did this specific statement actually show up? When did it become possible to even say this thing? Under what specific circumstances or rules? And how does this particular statement connect to or relate to other things being said or written within that same field at that same time?
So it's not a window into someone's head,
No.
but more like an artifact that appeared in a specific context governed by the rules of that context.
That's a good way to put it. The statement as an event occurring within a specific field of knowledge or practice. And when you look at these fields like clinical medicine or political economy, as the source material mentions, you often see what Foucault calls a dispersion of elements.
Dispersion, like things are scattered all over the place. Messy.
Kind of. You see different objects being talked about, different kinds of statements being made, various concepts floating around, competing theories or options. It might look a bit disconnected, maybe even contradictory on the surface.
You might see gaps, inconsistencies, things that don't quite fit together logically.
Absolutely. It can seem like a jumble. But Foucault suggests that the unity of this discourse, if there is a unity, doesn't come from the obvious horizontal coherence of these elements.
Meaning how neatly they line up or logically follow from one another?
Right. The coherence or the underlying system isn't found by trying to make all the pieces fit together smoothly like a puzzle.
So where does it come from then, if not from the logical links between the ideas themselves?
It resides, as the source puts it, well anterior to their formation.
Anterior, meaning before.
Yes, before they're even formed. It resides in the system that makes possible and governs that formation.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. A system that exists before the individual ideas or statements are even articulated, and that system is what determines what can be formed or said within that field.
Yes. Think of it like the fundamental rules of the game, maybe chess or something. Before anyone even makes a move, the rules exist, right?
Yeah, the rules define the pieces, how they move, what's a legal move, what's not.
Exactly. The rules determine what's possible within the game. That system of rules exists before any specific move is made. Foucault's system for a discourse is kind of like those underlying rules for a particular field of knowledge. It sets the conditions and determines how specific objects like madness, wealth, crime, statements about those objects, concepts, and theoretical choices could possibly be formed and talked about within that specific field at that specific time.
So it's the framework, the underlying structure that makes certain things sayable and thinkable, and other things just outside the realm of possibility for that discourse.
Precisely. It's the set of conditions that make speaking and knowing possible in a particular way at a particular moment.
That game analogy helps. It's less about the brilliant strategy of one player, the individual thinker, and more about the fundamental rules of the game that make any strategy, brilliant or not, even conceivable.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key term he uses, the archive.
Okay, now archive sounds like a dusty basement full of old papers.
Right, but that's not what Foucault means, not primarily anyway.
Yeah.
The archive, in his sense from Archaeology of Knowledge, isn't just a physical place where old documents are stored.
It's not.
No, it's the system that defines, right, at the very root of the statement event, the system of its enunciability.
Okay, enunciability, that sounds very philosophical. Can we unpack that?
Let's try. Think of it as the fundamental operating system, the deep rules that govern what can be said or what can even show up as a legitimate, meaningful statement within a particular discourse at a given historical moment.
So the archive is this background system that determines how a statement appears.
Yes, the mode of occurrence of the statement thing, as he puts it.
And how it works, how it functions within that field.
Exactly, the system of its functioning. It's the set of conditions, historical, institutional, conceptual, that makes speaking and knowing possible in a particular way. It's what makes certain statements possible and others impossible.
Okay, so the archive isn't trying to gather and unify everything that has been said.
No, quite the opposite in a way.
It's more about defining the boundaries, the rules of the game for what can be said at all within a specific discourse at a specific time, like the underlying grammar of a knowledge system.
That's a great way to think about it. It differentiates discourses. It specifies them in their own historical time frame. It helps explain why certain things could be said, understood, and considered true or relevant at one point in history.
Like diagnosing illness based on, say, the balance of humors.
Right. And why that same way of talking would be completely impossible, nonsensical even, at another point, say, after germ theory becomes dominant.
Yeah.
Or why a religious explanation for something might be valid in one context, but completely irrelevant in a medical context. The archive defines those possibilities.
That really starts to click if we think about the source material discussing, for example, how smallpox was understood in colonial India.
Okay.
Initially, there was this long-standing way of understanding it linked to beliefs about a deity's anger, right? The goddess Shitala.
Yes, that's...
So saying smallpox is caused by Shitala's wrath was a perfectly possible, understandable, legitimate statement within that specific discursive system tied to certain religious beliefs and practices.
Right. That religious discourse had its own archives, its own rules about what counted as a valid explanation for disease. It drew on concepts of deities, rituals, spiritual states, karma maybe. That was the system of enunciability.
But then the sources talk about the British introducing Western medicine, vaccination, germ theory.
Right. A completely different system arrived. This Western medical discourse came with its own archive, its own rules. It allowed for statements about microorganisms, contagion, immunity, anatomical pathology, public health interventions.
Statements that just weren't possible, didn't make sense within the deity wrath framework.
Exactly. The colonial power imposing Western medicine wasn't just bringing new ideas. They were, in a sense, imposing a different set of deep rules, a different archive for what could be said and known about the body, about disease, about reality itself. They were trying to replace, or at least subordinate, one system of enunciability with another.
Wow, that frames it really powerfully. It wasn't just a clash of beliefs, but a clash and an imposition of different fundamental systems for determining what even counts as a valid statement or knowledge.
And this archaeological approach Foucault takes, it isn't focused on celebrating the big eureka moments.
The lone genius discovering truth.
No, he's not trying to write that kind of traditional history of science that just lists the founding saints, Linnaeus for botany, Buffon for natural history, people like that.
So he's not interested in the narrative of the great individual innovator.
Not in the same way, no.
Right.
He's not focused on who was the most original or the first to say something. What he's looking for, what his archaeology digs for, is the regularity of a discursive practice.
Regularity. That sounds, well, less exciting than genius. What does that mean? Regularity.
It means he's looking for the consistent rules, the patterns, the shared ways of operating that were present across a whole field of discourse at a particular time. This regularity, this set of underlying rules, is in operation everywhere within that field. Yes. Not just in the really famous groundbreaking work, but also in the work of less well-known predecessors, in ideas that were simply borrowed or passed around, and even, as the source notes, in texts that just copied or repeated what others had already said.
So a textbook summary or a copied paragraph is just as interesting to him, from this perspective, as a completely new theory.
In a way, yes. Because they both operate according to the same underlying regularity. The source says a discovery is no less regular than the text that repeats and diffuses it. The same rules, the same system, is active whether something looks unique or totally banal. He argues there's no fundamental difference in nature from this archaeological viewpoint between creative statements and imitative statements.
Why not?
Because the entire field of statements, all of them, are active participants within the same underlying system, the same rules of practice for that time and place.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. This means, if I'm understanding it right, that to truly grasp how a field of knowledge, like, say, 18th century biology or 19th century criminology actually worked, you don't just study the superstars, the brilliant innovators. You have to study the underlying rules, the system, the regular practices that made it possible for any of these statements, whether revolutionary or just repetitive, to be made and accepted as legitimate within that field at that time.
You got it. It's about the shared, often invisible, ground rules. The system that governs what can be said, known, and considered true.
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from the individual mind or the single act of genius.
And onto the collective, historical, and often unconscious system of rules that govern how knowledge is produced and how it circulates.
Okay, so discourse is about the system, the rules, the archive, what can be said and known. But it's not just abstract language floating around, is it? It must connect to the real world, to people doing things, to institutions.
Absolutely. Foucault's very clear about this. Discourse isn't separate from social reality. It's deeply, deeply tangled up with practices, actions, and institutions. Well, he points out in Archaeology of Knowledge that when you analyze a discourse, like medical discourse, you can see its relationship not just to ideas, but to the specific individuals who are authorized to speak it.
And it's not just anyone who can speak authoritatively within a given discourse, is it? Like, I can't just declare someone medically insane.
Exactly. It's typically spoken by a certain number of statutorily designated individuals. Think doctors, professors, judges, priests, engineers, people who have a recognized status or role.
A role within a system or an institution.
Yes, and their ability to speak within that discourse is tied to the institutional relation they have. Being a doctor in a hospital, a professor in a university, a judge in a court. Their position gives their statements weight and legitimacy within that specific discourse.
So who gets to speak and who gets listened to is regulated. It's linked to their qualifications, their job, the place they're speaking from.
Yes, absolutely. It's intrinsically linked to their position and the authority that comes with it in that field.
Yeah.
And these discourses, like medical discourse, they also have functions to exercise in society.
Functions. You mean what they're actually used for in the practical world?
Precisely. Medical discourse isn't just used to describe diseases in a neutral way. It's used, for instance, for judging individuals.
Judging them.
Think about a psychiatric diagnosis classifying someone as mentally ill, or a medical diagnosis classifying someone as fit or unfit for work. These are judgments with real social consequences.
Okay.
It's used for making administrative decisions, deciding if someone qualifies for benefits, if they need to be institutionalized, if they can get insurance.
Right. Practical decisions based on medical classifications.
And it's used for laying down the norms of a society. Medical discourse often plays a huge role in defining what counts as a healthy body, normal psychological development, or even normal behavior. These medical ideas can become powerful social norms that we're all expected to measure up to.
And the source also mentioned it can be used to sort of translate or maybe even hide other kinds of conflicts or provide models for understanding society.
Yes, so a complex social issue like poverty or crime or social unrest might get reframed as a medical problem, social pathology, or a psychological issue, deviant personality, that needs expert treatment, which can sometimes obscure the underlying social or economic causes. Or ideas from medicine about how the body functions, its systems, its health, might be used metaphorically as a model to understand how society itself should work or be organized.
What's really fascinating here, and maybe a bit tricky, is Foucault isn't saying that politics or administration just invented medical concepts directly to serve their own purposes.
No, it's more complex than that.
He's looking at how medical discourse as a specific practice with its own objects, like diseases, symptoms, its authorized speakers, doctors, its concepts, its social functions, judging, normalizing, administering, how this practice gets articulated on or connected to practices that are external to it, practices that aren't necessarily linguistic or discursive themselves.
Exactly. So administrative practices like how a hospital is run or how public health campaigns are managed, economic practices like deciding who is fit for work, social norms about health, bodies, behavior. These things are primarily actions, structures, ways of doing things in the world, not just words.
Okay.
Medical discourse gets woven into these non-linguistic practices. It relies on them, and they rely on it. It becomes part of a complex network where ways of talking and knowing discourse enable and are enabled by ways of acting and organizing practices and power.
So it's not just words about the world.
No, it's words in the world, deeply connected to what people do, how power operates, and how society is structured. They shape each other.
Okay, that connection between discourse and practice is crucial. So we've talked about discourse, the system of what can be said and known, the rules, the archive. Now let's shift gears a bit to another major idea from Foucault, particularly from Discipline and Punish. This is about how individuals and bodies are shaped, trained, controlled, often in really subtle ways, right?
Yes, this is where we move more explicitly from the realm of knowledge and what can be said to the realm of how power operates directly on bodies, on behavior, on a much more granular, almost physical level.
And the source material really highlights a major historical shift in how societies, especially in Europe around the 18th and 19th centuries, dealt with crime and punishment.
It does. There was this older style.
Which sounds pretty grim from the source: public executions, torture used as a public spectacle. That description of Damien's execution at the start of the book is, well, it's unforgettable.
It was designed to be unforgettable. It was a public performance enacted directly on the body of the person condemned. The whole point was to display the raw, terrifying, seemingly unlimited power of the king or the ruler for everyone to see and fear.
A warning, basically.
A very brutal warning. But, as the source points out, this system, this spectacle of power, also carried inherent risks for the authorities.
Risks? What kind of risks could displaying absolute power possibly have? Seems counterintuitive.
Well, the source notes that during those public rituals, sometimes The people never felt closer to those who paid the penalty than in those rituals intended to show the horror of the crime and the invincibility of power.
Ah. So seeing the suffering, maybe seeing defiance or hearing last words, could actually make people sympathize with the condemned person. They
Exactly.
might see them not just as a criminal, but maybe as a victim of cruel power or even a kind of folk hero. It could stir up empathy or anger against the authorities.
Precisely. It could turn the whole scene of punishment into a kind of chaotic, reversible festival, as Foucault calls it. It risked sparking popular resistance, riots, or at least a strong sense of solidarity with the person being punished, undermining the intended message of power.
So the reformers, the people in charge in the late 18th century, they saw this danger.
They did. They recognized the potential for these volatile public displays to backfire, to actually strengthen the resolve of the very popular illegalities, the rule breaking by ordinary people that they wanted to suppress.
And they wanted something cleaner, more predictable, less risky.
Essentially, yes. They weren't necessarily trying to eliminate all rule-breaking, maybe focus more on protecting property rights, for instance,
Yeah.
but they wanted to manage and administer illegalities differentially.
Differentially, meaning treat different kinds of offenses or different classes of offenders differently, more control.
Yes, more control over who was breaking which rules and how they were dealt with. The new legal codes that emerged around this time often seemed less overtly violent, more rationalized and standardized on the surface. But the source points out they were backed up by a rigorous application of force designed to maintain control, particularly over those popular illegalities, the kinds of offenses often associated with the lower classes.
So less public horror, maybe, but more systematic, controlled force applied, perhaps more behind the scenes.
Yes, and critically, a shift in where the punishment was aimed. The new style, epitomized by the rise of the prison, became less about inflicting intense physical pain on the body in public.
And more about what?
More about controlling, correcting, reforming, transforming the individual, often done behind closed doors within an institution. This focus shifts from the tortured body to the inmate's soul, their character, their habits.
From the body to the soul. That's a big shift. And this leads Foucault to talk about the political technology of the body, right?
Exactly, that phrase comes up again.
It still sounds a bit ominous. Political technology of the body.
It describes how power operates to make bodies both useful, productive, efficient, and subjected, controlled, obedient at the same time. The source links it to sources of production.
Making bodies useful for work in factories, workshops, armies?
Yes, but it's also a system of subjection, where even basic needs or physical capabilities can become instruments of political control. How people are housed, fed, made to move.
But you said that this control isn't always violent like the old tortures?
Right, that's key. This system of subjection, this political technology, can be calculated, organized, technically thought out, subtle, make use neither of weapons nor of terror, and yet remain of a physical order.
Subtle physical control. How does that work? Is it like training bodies, getting them used to certain movements, certain routines without actual force?
Precisely. It's a whole set of techniques for organizing bodies in space, where they are placed, in time, what they do when, regulating their movements, ensuring their obedience, making them efficient. Foucault calls it a knowledge of the body that is not exactly the science of its functioning. It's not anatomy or physiology, and a mastery of its forces that is more than the ability to conquer them by brute force.
So it's about organizing and training bodies to be effective, obedient, predictable within specific systems like schools, factories, armies, prisons.
Exactly. And this technology, he argues, is diffuse. It's not located in one single place or held by one single authority. It operates in bits and pieces, a multiform instrumentation across various institutions. What these institutions deploy is a microphysics of power.
Microphysics, like power working at a really small, detailed level.
Yes, operating right down at the level of individual bodies, gestures, habits. It works in the space between the big functions of society, like the economy or the state, and the bodies themselves. It's power operating on our movements, our schedules, our posture, in tiny, systematic, everyday ways that we might not even register as power at all.
Wow. Not just the king's decree or the judge's sentence, but power built into the timetable, the layout of the room, the way you're trained to hold a tool.
Exactly. It's not just the visible hand of the law, but power operating at a molecular level, structuring our physical existence. And in this new system of punishment that emerges, judicial torture used to physically force a confession, produce truth through pain, it largely disappears from the official legal process.
Good riddance, you might say.
You might. But Foucault argues that investigation, examination, and punishment get tangled up in a new, maybe more insidious way.
How so, if torture is gone?
Because now, the criminal's soul is brought before the court. It's no longer just about judging the illegal act itself. The focus shifts to judging who the person is.
Their character, their background, their psychology.
Yes, their personality, their history, their environment, their potential for future danger or rehabilitation. This is where the emerging human sciences, psychiatric expertise, criminal anthropology, criminology start to play a crucial role within the justice system.
So psychology and these other sciences come into the courtroom, into the prison.
Absolutely. They provide, as the source says, a justifiable hold not only on offenses, but on individuals, not only on what they do, but also on what they are, will be, maybe.
So it's not just, did you commit this crime, but like, what kind of person are you? Are you dangerous? Can you be fixed?
Precisely. The offender's soul, their inner self, their potential, this becomes an object of scientific knowledge, scrutiny, classification, and, crucially, becomes part of what is judged and punished or managed by the system. It's not just an explanation for the past crime. It's the target of intervention for the future.
And the prison became the main tool for doing this, for working on the individual soul.
The prison emerges as the key dominant instrument of punishment in the 19th century, replacing public execution and other forms. But, Foucault stresses, it's conceived not just as simple detention locking people away. It's seen as a technique for the coercion of individuals, using methods of training the body, and through that, reforming the soul.
Training the body to reform the soul.
Yeah. The source quotes the reformers saying punishment should be a school rather than a festival, an ever-open book rather than a ceremony. The idea was that punishment should be quiet, continuous, legible lessons in discipline and morality, not explosive public dramas.
And the source even mentioned reformers suggesting children should visit punishment places for civics lessons.
Yes, a field trip to the prison to learn good citizenship. It really underscores that shift from spectacle aimed at terrifying the crowd to a model focused on training, education, and normalization of the individual.
It's quite a different vision of power.
It is. And although imprisonment itself was initially criticized by some reformers because it was linked historically to the arbitrary power of monarchs, locking people up in secret dungeons, sacred prisons conjured up by the fatal spirit of monarchism, it very quickly became the dominant, seemingly most rational and humane form of punishment.
Why? What made the prison seem so suitable?
Foucault describes the prison as a complete and austere institution. It's like a concentrated and austere figure of all the disciplines. And here's a really critical, maybe counterintuitive point the source makes. The prison, embodying these disciplinary techniques, was actually constituted outside the traditional legal apparatus first.
Outside the law, how could that happen? I thought prisons were part of the justice system.
The techniques that define the prison, the methods for controlling and transforming individuals, these were being developed and refined elsewhere before the prison became the main legal penalty.
Elsewhere? Like where?
In places like workshops, schools, monasteries, military barracks. Institutions that were figuring out efficient procedures for distributing individuals in space, assigning them specific spots, fixing them in place, classifying them by skill, by behavior, extracting maximum time and force from them, making them work efficiently, training their bodies and habits through drills and routines, coding their behavior according to detailed rules, maintaining constant visibility and surveillance over them.
Keeping an eye on everyone, all the time.
Yes. And forming an apparatus of observation and recording, writing everything down, keeping files, tracking progress or infractions. And through all this, constituting a body of knowledge about these individuals.
So all these methods for managing groups of people.
The source puts it very clearly. The general form of an apparatus intended to render individuals docile and useful by means of precise work upon their bodies indicated the prison institution before the law ever defined it as the penalty par excellence.
Wow. So the blueprint for the prison, the techniques for making people docile and useful, already existed. They were developed in schools and factories and armies.
That's the argument, yes.
And the prison is just where all these techniques came together, got intensified, perfected maybe.
And then colonized the legal system. They became the seemingly obvious natural way to punish, replacing the older methods. The prison becomes the ultimate expression, the most visible symbol of these widespread disciplinary techniques becoming central to how society manages, controls, and produces individuals.
Okay, that's a huge idea. Let's dive deeper into these specific disciplinary techniques then. What are they? What do they look like in practice? And where else besides prisons do we see them operating according to the sources?
Right. The source material gives us a good breakdown of techniques aimed at ordering human multiplicities, which just means groups of people, basically, large or small.
Okay.
One fundamental technique is partitioning and verticality. This means creating solid separations, walls, designated spaces between individuals or small groups within the larger crowd.
Like individual cells in a prison or assigned desks in a classroom.
Exactly. And establishing hierarchical networks, creating an individualizing pyramid.
So, splitting people up into manageable units, arranging them in clear layers of authority or rank, and giving each individual a specific place within that structure, like soldiers in platoons led by sergeants, led by officers, or students in grades, maybe even rows within the grade.
Precisely. It breaks down the potentially adverse force of multiplicity. It prevents the group from becoming a unified, potentially resistant, or chaotic mass. By separating, classifying, and arranging individuals in space and hierarchy, they become much easier to supervise and control individually.
Makes sense. And these techniques are also about increasing utility, right? Making the group or the individuals in it more productive or useful.
Yes, absolutely. And often by using the structure of the group itself, this involves methods like strict timetables to regulate every moment of activity.
No wasted time.
Right. Collective training, or drills to standardize actions, regular exercises to build skills and automatic habits, and crucially, total and detailed surveillance.
Watching everyone all the time in detail.
That's the ideal, yes. Think about the bell schedule in a school, the minute-by-minute routine, or the coordinated movements on a factory assembly line, or the constant observation and charting in a hospital ward. It's about maximizing efficiency and control through regulation and observation.
That sounds incredibly structured, almost machine-like.
It is. The goal is to increase the overall effective utility of the group, making the whole operation more effective, predictable, and productive than just the sum of its individual, uncoordinated parts.
How do they achieve that?
Through tactics like precise distribution of individuals to specific tasks or locations based on assessment, the reciprocal adjustment of bodies, gestures, and rhythms, so people move and work together smoothly, almost automatically.
Like synchronized swimmers, but for work or discipline.
Kind of, yeah. The differentiation of capacities, figuring out who's good at what and assigning them accordingly, and overall coordination, getting everyone operating together efficiently, predictably, in a standardized way.
Like a well-oiled machine, or maybe a tightly controlled orchestra, as you said earlier.
A very controlled orchestra, yes. And importantly, these techniques bring power into play inside the group itself. Power operates discreetly, often without needing big displays of force or authority.
How? If it's discrete.
It uses what Foucault calls anonymous instruments. Things like hierarchical surveillance, where everyone is watched, and the watchers are watched by others above them, right up the pyramid.
So you never quite know who's watching or when.
Exactly. And continuous registration, keeping detailed written records, files, reports on every individual.
The endless paperwork.
And perpetual assessment and classification, constant exams, performance reviews, grading, ranking, evaluations.
So power isn't just the boss yelling or the guard with a stick. It's built into the very system. The constant watching, the files being kept on you, the never-ending process of being graded and ranked against others.
That's exactly. It substitutes the old, spectacular power of brilliance, the king on his throne, the executioner on the scaffold, with a power that's less visible, more systematic, more bureaucratic, and which insidiously objectifies those on whom it is applied.
Objectifies them, turns them into objects.
Yes, objects of knowledge and control. Through all this documentation, assessment, and classification, you become a case, a file, a data point, a rank, a grade, a known and manageable object within the system. The overall aim across all these techniques and institutions is clear. Increase the docility and utility of all the elements.
Docility and utility, there's that phrase again, making people both easier to control, docile, and more productive or functional within the system. Useful.
It really captures the twin goals of these disciplinary techniques, whether they're being applied in a prison, a school, a factory, a hospital, or a military unit.
And the source materials you were given provide some really concrete examples of this beyond just the prison, right? Let's connect it directly.
Yes, absolutely. Let's start with military discipline. The source describes a really significant shift there. Training moved away from the old model, where recruits would just try to copy a veteran soldier.
Learning by example.
Right. The new disciplinary approach broke down time into precise segments. It organized movements and tasks analytically, starting with simple elements and building up to complex ones. Instruction was based on mastering the elementary components of an action, not just imitating the exemplary performance of a master.
So it was like learning building blocks. First, how to stand perfectly still. Then, how to hold the rifle just so. Then, how to take exactly one step forward, each part taught and perfected separately before combining them.
Yes, exactly that kind of analytical breakdown and repetition. And crucially, they introduced regular examinations at the end of each training segment. These weren't just pass-fail tests.
What else were they?
The source points out they had a triple function. One, to check if the required level of skill was actually reached. Two, to guarantee that everyone went through the same standardized apprenticeship, producing interchangeable soldiers.
Right.
And three, to differentiate individuals based on their abilities and performance.
So sorting them out, ranking them.
Yes, they would then draw up series for individuals according to his level, his seniority, his rank, creating detailed classifications and hierarchies within the military based on measured performance in these standardized drills and tests.
So discipline creates these individualizing categories and ranks based on constant assessment, not just based on who your father was or who the king appointed.
Exactly. It's a hierarchy produced by the disciplinary system itself based on its own criteria of performance and conformity.
Okay. What about school discipline? The source contrasts the older Jesuit college model, large classes, maybe rivalry between big groups.
Yeah, a more general, less individualized approach sometimes. The 18th and 19th centuries saw that shift towards what we'd recognize more easily as a modern classroom. The educational space itself was unfolded, standardized. Classrooms became more uniform spaces.
Rows of desks.
Often, yes. The class group became more homogeneous students of roughly the same age or achievement level put together, and rank became a key principle for distributing individuals within that space.
Rank, you mean like grades?
Hmm.
Or being seated based on how well you did on the last test?
Exactly. Rows, ranks based on merit or performance.
Yeah.
And this rank was formally attributed after specific tasks and, very importantly, exams. And school discipline relied heavily on a gratification punishment system.
Rewards and punishments, gold stars and detention.
Pretty much. Good marks, bad marks, privileges, penalties. The source even calls it a penal accountancy.
Penal accountancy, like keeping a ledger, debits and credits for every student's behavior and work.
Precisely. Making conduct and performance quantifiable, calculable. It's a system where everything a student does, good or bad, gets plotted somewhere between positive and negative poles, good and evil poles, as the source puts it. You could literally calculate a running score or balance sheet for each individual student based on their conformity to the rules and their academic performance.
Wow. That system of constant assessment, recording, ranking, and accounting, it sounds very much like the military example.
It is. It's absolutely central to how school discipline functions to shape individuals.
Okay, military and school are clear examples. What about hospitals? You mentioned the paperwork there was more than just keeping track of patients.
Yes, the source highlights hospitals becoming laboratories for scripturary and documentary methods. This meant developing increasingly detailed ways of writing things down, keeping comprehensive registers on every patient, specifying them in detail, diagnosis, symptoms, treatments given, responses observed, transcribing notes meticulously, circulating this information among staff, comparing data during meetings, transmitting summarized data to central authorities, maintaining an ongoing accountancy of diseases, cures, deaths.
That sounds like the birth of the modern medical record and also medical statistics.
It is. But Foucault's point is that this intense focus on documentation wasn't just for better individual patient care or scientific knowledge in the abstract. It was integral to subjecting hospitals to a disciplinary regime.
How did paperwork help discipline the hospital?
It helped organize the entire institution, the space, the staff, the patients, according to systematic rules and procedures. And critically, it was central to forming a body of knowledge about patients, not just knowledge about diseases in general, but specific recorded knowledge about each individual patient.
So collecting all this data, symptoms, treatments, outcomes, comparing cases, it wasn't just for treating the person in the bed right then.
Not only that, it was part of a systematic effort to control the hospital space, manage the patient population efficiently, and produce standardized knowledge about patients as individuals and as categories, like cases of tuberculosis, post-operative recoveries.
So the patient becomes an object of constant observation, documentation, classification within this medical system.
Precisely. Known, recorded, compared, managed, based on the accumulated, documented knowledge about them. It allows for classification, comparison, and the systematic administration of individuals based on that knowledge.
It's starting to feel like these disciplinary techniques, ordering, classifying, observing, recording, training, normalizing, are just everywhere, incredibly pervasive.
They're designed to be pervasive, operating across many different sites.
So let's try to bridge this carefully, using the details from the sources you were given to some of the other things you provided. This is where we might be extending Foucault's core analysis a bit, but let's see how the lens fits. First, what about media and cartoons? This source talks about cartoons influencing children's behavior, shaping their preferences for toys or activities, introducing gender stereotypes, and even creating a necessity for products through ads linked to the shows. We saw data like kids spending huge amounts of time watching screens.
Yeah, thousands of hours mentioned.
And this influencing language sometimes leading to aggression or very strong gender stereotyped play, like the examples of Sabir wanting only boy characters and Nadia only girl characters. How might a Foucauldian lens look at this?
It's a really interesting and relevant connection to make, though, as you say, we're applying concepts developed mainly for institutions like prisons and schools to contemporary cultural forms. Foucault himself talked about how discipline spread throughout the social body, operating subtly, often through normalization rather than force, and how they form knowledge about individuals to manage them. Media, like cartoons and the advertising woven into them, certainly play a powerful role today in shaping our understanding of what's normal, what's desirable, what are the accepted ways to behave, look, or even feel. They contribute massively to forming a body of knowledge in society about things like gender roles, consumer desires, social interactions, even what counts as fun or success.
So instead of physical drills in a barracks or a strict timetable in a school, media works through representation, through influence, creating desires and expectations, shaping the soul or subjectivity culturally.
You could argue that, yes. Think about the source mentioning those explicit gender stereotypes in cartoons. The heroic boy, the nurturing girl. Through constant repetition, remember those thousands of hours, these media forms offer models. These present certain norms as natural, obvious, or ideal. They implicitly classify characters and, by extension, viewers.
Classify viewers.
By encouraging identification with certain roles, desires, and expectations based on gender, age, etc., this aligns with the disciplinary technique of classification and establishing norms. Are you the adventurous boy type? The pretty girl type? The cool kid with the right toy? Media constantly presents these categories, and the advertising creating a necessity for products. That's a subtle but powerful way of shaping desires, integrating individuals into consumer culture, making them useful subjects for the economy in a specific way. It's not coercion like a prison guard, but it systematically works on individuals to shape their wants and behaviors. It contributes to a form of cultural discipline that guides people toward conforming to certain social and economic roles and norms.
It's shaping our understanding of who we are supposed to be, what we are supposed to want, often through really appealing stories and images rather than direct orders.
Exactly. It operates through representation, normalization, and the management of desire. It lays down norms for identity and behavior.
That's a really thought-provoking parallel. A much more diffused, maybe less obviously physical way of shaping individuals, but potentially just as powerful in its reach and consistency. Okay, what about patriarchy and gender roles, based on those sources about women in literature, religious texts, history, myths? They talk about how language, scriptures, cultural stories perpetuate patriarchal values, define expectations for women like chastity, obedience, motherhood as the ideal, and contribute to their social subordination.
These sources are describing exactly what Foucault would call discursive practices, specific ways of talking, writing, and thinking about gender that are deeply embedded in cultural texts, social institutions like religion, marriage law, family structures, and the common stories we tell.
So the stories and rules aren't just reflecting reality, they're actively shaping it.
Yes, they function as discursive practices that actively classify individuals based on gender. They define what counts as good femininity, or acceptable female roles, like the source noting motherhood within marriage as primary and women who reject it seen as deviant. They lay down powerful norms and expectations for behavior, appearance, social function, relationships, all based on gender.
Can you give an example from the sources?
The Sabarimala temple controversy mentioned in one source is a potent example. A specific religious discourse, based on myths about a deity's celibacy, gets linked to institutional practices, the temple's rules about who can enter. This discourse classifies menstruating women as impure or unsuitable for that sacred space.
So a biological characteristic gets interpreted through a specific discourse to justify exclusion and classification.
Precisely. It's discourse and practice intertwining to classify individuals, establish norms around purity, sanctity, gender roles, and restrict who can be what and where. This clearly reinforces existing power asymmetries based on gender and religious authority.
So the stories, the rules, even the language we use about gender, they function as a kind of discourse that classifies us, limits us, and ranks us based on how well we conform to the established norms of masculinity or femininity.
Exactly. The source that notes language itself is ideologically marked by patriarchy, and used as a tool of power really hits this point. The very words we use, the assumptions embedded in them, are part of the discursive system that perpetuates inequality. It classifies, differentiates, and reinforces power imbalances. It's a knowledge power system shaping who we understand ourselves and others to be based on these deeply ingrained gendered norms.
Okay. And finally, let's look at colonialism and history through this lens, based on the source about decolonial interventions. This source discusses how colonizers often created what they presented as the one true history, often a linear mechanical chronology,
Right.
by diminishing, dismissing, or actively erasing indigenous histories, myths, and ways of knowing, leading to ideological deformations and even epistemicide, the killing of knowledge systems.
This connects incredibly powerfully with Foucault's concepts of the archive and the system of enunciability that we started with. Colonial powers didn't just conquer land and people, they imposed their own system for determining what counted as legitimate knowledge, valid history, objective reality.
They rewrote the history books, basically.
It was more fundamental than just rewriting the books. They sought to change the rules for how history could be written, understood, and validated. They defined what could be said and known about the past and present within the colonized territory, and crucially, how it could be said, for example, based on written documents fitting a European timeline.
So they impose their archive, their system of what counts as a legitimate statement.
Exactly. They marginalized, ignored, or actively tried to destroy other discursive systems, like the rich indigenous histories embedded in oral traditions, stories, rituals, connections to the land which, as the source notes, are absolutely vital for sustaining indigenous people's identity, continuity, and ways of knowing. This is a clear, large-scale example of how power operates to shape the archive, to control the system of enunciability. It leads to those ideological deformations and the active exclusion or destruction, epistemicide, of other degrees of being and knowing. It's a struggle over the very rules of reality.
And the other source mentioning a modern Hindu right-wing group using specific versions of history and mythology in publications to indoctrinate children. That seems like a contemporary example of the same process.
It absolutely does. It shows power actively shaping discourse and knowledge, using history, mythology, carefully selected narratives to classify people, us versus them, mobilize individuals around a particular identity, define who belongs, who doesn't, and establish a specific version of truth as dominant, often by suppressing or attacking alternative accounts. It's using discourse to shape subjects and enforce a particular social and political order.
It really does seem like these disciplinary techniques for ordering and shaping people and these discursive systems for defining what's knowable and sayable are operating constantly all around us, whether in formal institutions or in broader cultural narratives and media. They create order, they classify us, they reinforce norms.
Yes, and the source on discipline and punish adds another crucial layer to understanding the nature of this disciplinary power. Foucault suggests that the relationships created by these techniques, disciplinary links, are fundamentally different from traditional legal or contractual relationships.
How are they different?
Legal or contractual links, at least in theory, are often based on an idea of equality between parties before the law. Disciplinary links, however, inherently involve subordination, inequality, and what Foucault calls surplus power, held by the institution or authority.
Surplus power.
Yeah, power that goes beyond just enforcing a specific rule or contract. Disciplines, remember, characterize, classify, specialize individuals. They distribute people along a scale, around a norm. They rank them, hierarchize them, and they can even disqualify them if they deviate too far from that norm.
So they create these detailed categories and rankings, not just based on whether you broke a universal law, but on how closely you fit a specific standard or norm defined within that particular system, like being a good student, an efficient worker, a reformed prisoner.
Precisely. And the source makes a very provocative claim about this. It says that discipline, in its mechanism, is a counter law.
A counter law, operating against the official law.
Not necessarily replacing it entirely, but operating alongside it, or maybe underneath it. It functions on the underside of the law, a machinery that is both immense and minute.
A huge, detailed machinery working beneath the surface of the legal system.
Yes, a machinery that creates and reinforces power asymmetries at a very fine-grained level. It often undermines the formal equality or the limits that legal systems might try to establish. These small techniques of discipline, Foucault argues, while sometimes presented as neutral or necessary for social order, are actually a series of mechanisms for unbalancing power relations definitively and everywhere.
Unbalancing power relations.
Yes, tilting the scales constantly in favor of the system, the institution, the norm. He calls them physico-political techniques, techniques that blend physical control and regulation of bodies with political power, acting directly on our bodies and behaviors, constantly sorting us, shaping us, and measuring us against norms.
Physico-political techniques. Blending physical training and control with power, constantly sorting and shaping us to be obedient and useful, defining what's normal and ranking us.
Yes, making individuals both docile and useful within specific systems of power. And in doing so, producing specific kinds of subjects: the disciplined student, the efficient worker, the manageable patient, the reformed criminal, and thereby producing and maintaining a specific kind of social order.
Okay, this is a lot to take in, but seeing the connections to the source materials, the examples, really helps make it more concrete. We've explored how Foucault's archaeology gives us this lens to look at the systems, the rules, the archive that make discourse possible, rather than just hunting for individual intentions.
Right, looking at what makes certain statements possible in the first place.
And we've seen how his concept of discipline shows power operating not just through force, but through these detailed techniques: surveillance, examination, normalization that shape our bodies, train our behavior, classify us, and create knowledge about us.
Knowledge that is then used to manage and control us further.
And these techniques extend far beyond prisons, into schools, hospitals, the military, and maybe even, as we discussed, into cultural forces like media and the narratives that define things like gender or history.
A framework that really pushes us to see how knowledge and power are inseparable. They work together, often in very subtle but pervasive ways, to produce the kinds of individuals we are and the kind of society we live in. They shape what feels normal, who we understand ourselves to be, what seems possible.
So to bring it back to you, listening to this deep dive, what does all this mean for you? Why do these perhaps abstract-sounding ideas from a French philosopher actually matter in everyday life?
Well, Foucault's ideas challenge us to look beyond the most obvious places we expect to find power, like the government, the police, laws, overt violence.
He suggests power is much more spread out, diffused.
Yes, operating in subtle, often invisible ways through the very systems and institutions we interact with constantly.
Like the schools you went to, the place you work, the doctor's office you visit, even the websites you browse or the shows you watch.
Exactly. This microphysics of power. Working through these disciplinary techniques shapes our bodies, our habits, our daily routines. It shapes our understanding of what is normal, acceptable, successful, healthy, or even possible for us to do or be.
How does it do that?
Through those mechanisms we talked about: classification, putting people into categories; assessment, judging them against standards; normalization, establishing what's normal and identifying deviation; organizing space and time. It's through these processes that society creates categories for individuals: student, patient, worker, citizen, mother, normal, abnormal, male, female, delinquent, etc., and defines the norms and expectations associated with those categories.
And understanding this helps you see that knowledge isn't neutral, that the ways we classify and study things are tied up with power.
Absolutely. Think about that figure of the delinquent the source mentions.
The person who broke the law, but is also studied by science.
Right. In the modern system, the delinquent isn't just an offender against the law. They become an object of scientific technique: medicine, psychology, criminology, social work. The justice system relies on these experts and their disciplines to provide a truth about the individual offender.
What caused them to do it? Are they dangerous? Can they be reformed?
Exactly. This figure of the delinquent, understood through science, allows the justice system to operate with this aura of scientific objectivity and truth. It's a perfect example of how knowledge, the human sciences, and power, the justice system, the prison, combine to create and manage a specific type of individual subject, the delinquent, who is both a legal category and a scientific object to be known and corrected.
So if you start using this Foucauldian lens, you can look at things you encounter every day and ask some pretty different questions, can't you?
You really can. You can apply it to question how different discourses, Political speeches, news reports, advertising, scientific papers, even casual conversations or cultural myths about gender or race, how they all work to create specific understandings of the world and position people within it. How do they define the terms? What categories do they create? What norms do they reinforce?
And you can look at institutions or practices you're part of. How are students evaluated in this course? How is performance measured at my job? How are different social groups talked about online? How are medical conditions defined and treated? And you can ask.
What are the underlying rules operating here? How are individuals being classified, observed, assessed, trained, or shaped? What kind of knowledge is being produced about people in this system? And how is that knowledge being used? What counts as normal here? And who benefits from that definition of normal?
It encourages a deeper, more critical way of looking at the world, seeing the power dynamics hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. It helps you see the often hidden ways power works, not just by saying no or using force, but through these quieter, more pervasive methods of classification, normalization, the subtle shaping of who we are, and the control of what can be known and said about us.
It definitely changes how you might look at things. It's quite powerful.
Hopefully, it gives you a useful tool, another lens for critical analysis, a way to better understand the complex systems that shape our shared reality and our individual experiences within it.
So, just to recap this deep dive then, we've explored how Foucault's archaeology digs beneath the surface of what's said to find the systems, the rules, the archive that make discourse possible in the first place. We've moved beyond just looking for hidden meanings or author intentions.
Right. Focusing on the conditions of possibility for statements themselves.
And we've seen how his concept of discipline reveals power operating through incredibly detailed techniques: surveillance, examination, partitioning space and time, normalization techniques that shape our bodies, train our behaviors, classify us constantly, and create specific kinds of knowledge about us as individuals.
Knowledge that is inseparable from the power that produces and uses it.
And we saw how these techniques aren't confined to prisons, but extend into schools, hospitals, the military, and arguably even into the cultural sphere through media and dominant narratives that classify us and tell us what's normal.
It's a framework that relentlessly shows how knowledge and power are tangled together, working constantly to produce the kinds of individuals and the kind of society we live in.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on based on all this. If, as the source suggests, these disciplinary techniques are operating everywhere, often subtly, on the underside of the law, constantly classifying us and distributing us around norms, how much of what we think of as our purely personal identity, our unique self, our private desires, our sense of what feels natural or normal for us, how much of that is actually shaped, trained, maybe even produced by these external systems and the norms they relentlessly create and enforce?
It's a challenging question. Where does the system end and the individual begin?
What stands out to you from this deep dive into Foucault's ideas? What connections did you make?